Dámy a pánové, já vás srdečně vítám v nejvyšším purkrabství na Pražském hradě při další přednášce z našeho cyklu Věda na hradě, kterou pro vás připravila Správa Pražského hradu ve spolupráci s Ústavem organické chemie a biochemie Akademie věd a Karlovou univerzitou. A tento cyklus podpořila nadace IOCB Tech a tuto speciální přednášku také nadace CERGE EI. A dneska máme speciálního hosta, který přijel k nám až ze zámoří a je to profesor ekonomie ze Stanfordu a nositel Nobelovy ceny za ekonomii Alvin Roth. Very well welcome, Mr. Roth. Just a second, because já bych poprosila profesora Štěpána Jurajdu, který zde bude tak laskav a pana profesora trošku blíže představí. Děkuji.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure and honor, of course, to be able to introduce Al Roth, the 2012 Nobel laureate in economics. An honor and pleasure which is marred only by the minor fact that I have no business introducing Al. As a labor economist, I've never done any work in auction theory or market design. But I had the great pleasure of actually having Al teach me game theory in the early 1990s at the University of Pittsburgh before Al moved on to Harvard and Stanford. And I still remember that course is the most fun I ever had in classroom. Still, yeah. Now, Al is a pioneer of market design, one of the fathers of experimental economics. He worked in bargaining, learning in games, auction theory, 230 papers, 60,000 citations, 20 patent citations. But more importantly, Al exemplifies, personifies the motto of economist as an engineer, the title of his 2002 Econometrica paper. And what I mean by that is that Al combines deep theoretical insights, cutting-edge research, with deep engagement with communities outside of economics. And as a result, his research translates into real impact on people's lives. And so his work has made many people's lives quite a bit better, both in terms of health and happiness and prosperity in terms of education, because we economists know education has causal impacts of that sort. Now, Al is still at it. Last year, he published 8 papers, which, for those of us who should be publishing every year, it's a large number, both in health and econ journals, including a top 5 JPE experimental paper on regulations of transplantation centers, which suggests that the regulation that is currently used actually creates perverse incentives for both the organ procurement and the efficiency of transplantations. So it's just, again, a complete and utter delight to welcome Al, and thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. And it's a delight to be here. Can we make the microphone a little lower? I'm hearing it very loudly. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, wonderful. So it's a pleasure to be here, not least because Surge EI is something that when we were at the University of Pittsburgh was just being formed. And so this is my first visit to it, and it's nice to see what a thriving scientific institution it is and has become. So I'm going to talk to you today about market design and more particularly about matching markets and about economists as engineers. And one of the things you can say about markets is many people don't think about markets the way economists think about them. So about 10 years ago, I wrote a book on market design called Who Gets What and Why. And books can be translated into languages. And we don't think that's unusual, right? I mean, I have it on good authority that this is a Czech translation. But there are lots of different languages. Lots of different languages. And it turns out that markets and languages have a lot in common. Not just that there are different languages, there are also many different kinds of markets. And what markets and marketplaces additionally have in common with languages is that they're human artifacts. We don't often think of them that way, but of course language is something we make so that we can communicate and coordinate with each other, and the same can be said about markets and marketplaces. Those are tools that we make to serve particular purposes. And of course languages evolve. There are lots of new words in Czech that didn't used to be, like computer and internet and artificial intelligence, and those are new words in English also, so we adapt languages as we need to. And similarly, we need to adapt markets as we need to. We don't just receive them. Now, I'm speaking to you in English. Of course, I can't, on the fly, make up new variants of English, because then you wouldn't understand me. And similarly, when we start to think about markets as tools that have to be adapted to the times, there are some constraints. We can't change them however we want. And so that's the topic of my talk today. In particular, I want to talk to you about matching markets, which are not the markets you most often think of when you think of a market. Because matching markets are markets where who you deal with is important. Okay? And therefore, and I'll tell you about this, prices don't do all the work. Okay? And I'm going to tell you about two markets that are unusual and that have some relevance for Czechia, where we don't even let prices do any of the work. Okay, so before I talk about that, let me remind you what I think most people think of when they think of a market, which is a commodity market. So here's a picture of the New York Stock Exchange. Right, a lot of trades on the New York Stock Exchange are now electronic, but there's a big building, and people used to come to the building and trade with each other securities sold on the stock exchange. And in a commodity market, you don't care who you're dealing with. If you want to buy 1,000 shares of Microsoft, you don't care who you're buying from. You don't worry whether they took good care of those shares when they had them. And they don't care who they're selling to. They won't worry whether you'll take good care of the shares. All that matters is the price. And the job of the commodity market is to find the prices at which supply equals demand at each moment for each security that's being traded. Okay, so you're not developing a relationship between the buyers and sellers. Okay. And similarly, if I want to buy a car, Skoda will sell me any car I want if I can afford it. Okay, so they don't care who I am. I might care who they are if I particularly wanted a Skoda, but they don't care who I am. I can come with sufficient money and they sell me the car. Okay, but matching markets are markets that don't work that way. Even when prices are important, they're not the only thing that matters, because in matching markets matching markets are the markets in which you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it. You also have to be chosen. Okay? So, just incidentally, you can't just choose your spouse, you also have to be chosen. And there are lots of markets that work that way. Okay? I teach at Stanford, and you can't just decide to study at Stanford, and you can't just decide to study at GI, at Charles University. You have to be admitted. And you can't just tell Google or Skoda that you're showing up for work. You have to be hired. And Stanford can't just decide who its students are either. We have to offer you admission on attractive enough terms and be an attractive enough university that you'll decide to come to us instead of University of California at Berkeley. So these are markets that are a little bit like marriage. You can't just choose who you want. On either side, you have to be chosen also. And labor markets are like that in general. And of course, university admissions and also school admissions to a certain extent are like that. And just like marriage, a big part of marriage markets is courtship. You need to gather information and find someone who you want to marry who also wants to marry you. Okay, so that makes it important who you are dealing with. Matching markets involve relationships of some sort. You don't make, Sir GI doesn't hire its new assistant professors by lowering the wage until just enough economists want to come work there, although it may seem that way sometime. But they make offers to particular people. And they make offers at different wages. So it's not that wages aren't important, but the relationship, the match is important. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about different matching markets these days, and I'm going to try to be aware of. Oh no, I already turned off my phone. I can't be aware of the time that way. I'll just try to be careful. One of the kinds of matching markets you might be familiar with are actual dating markets, right? Markets to make, you know, romantic matches and sometimes marriages. And here's a graph that talks about how American couples have met each other over the years, right? So to get to the surprising thing first, now when you ask American married couples, how did you meet? The modal answer is we met on the internet. But this graph actually tells a complicated story about the evolution of American society, because in 1940, the answer to that question was friends. Let's see, we've got met in primary or secondary school, right? That's right up there here, and where am I? Neighbors? Yeah. Family. Okay, family. Thank you. So, you know, meeting in primary school, in 1940, Americans were much less mobile than we are now. So it didn't mean that you became romantically involved in primary school. What it meant was there was some cohort in your town of people around your age growing up, and when you got to high school and started to date, the people you knew were the people who had been in second grade with you, and you know, as you approach high school graduation, you married each other. Okay, so friends have remained important, but other things have come and gone, like meeting at work, things like that. So that's not my subject today, but studying matching is a way to illuminate a lot of important things that happen in the world. Okay, now there's new kinds of matchmaking going on in the world now. I'm going to tell you a little bit about transplants at the bottom there, but think about Uber and Airbnb, which are both markets that I know are active in Prague. They are very different kind of matching markets, and one of the differences is how much information they need. So Uber already has a pretty good idea of what you want. You want a driver who can come quickly. So they want to match each traveler to a driver who's close. And Uber knows where you are because you have a smartphone with GPS on it. So it's a market that depends on very recent technology, but the preferences are pretty simple. And you put in your preferences by saying where you want to go. Okay? Airbnb has a much more complicated problem. You want an apartment to stay in Prague for a month, say, but it's hard to tell them what you want because you care about the location, but you also care about whether the living room looks nice and whether there's a view from the window and lots of things. So what they have to do, they can't just automatically match you to an apartment. They have to show you apartments so you can start expressing your preferences. Right? So these are different kinds of technology. And incidentally, they depend on different kinds of technology. Not only do they have different matching technology, Airbnb started as an internet market that you could access on your computer. But Uber couldn't be a marketplace until the smartphone was invented because you're out on the street and you need a car and you have to be able to communicate to Uber where you are. Okay, so let's think what marketplaces do. What are some of the common things that all these different marketplaces have to accomplish to make their market work well? And there are three things I'll sort of talk about a little bit. One is thickness. The marketplace has to attract enough people to the market so that there are enough Ubers around when you need a ride and there are enough Airbnb apartments when you want to find a place to stay. But then once it creates a thick marketplace, it has to deal with congestion. All of a sudden there are lots of potential matches that could be made, and you can't necessarily express a preference for each one of them. So they have to do something quick so that you can quickly sort through all the opportunities, or they can sort through the opportunities for you. And then, of course, markets have to be trustworthy and safe. Okay, so let's think about how Airbnb deals with these things. Okay, so initially there weren't a lot of apartments available on Airbnb. They started as a website in San Francisco, and one of the things they did early on is they bought some of their competitors. So an early acquisition was CrashPatter in London. So I think that was maybe their first acquisition. So all of a sudden they had apartments in San Francisco and in London, and that made a bigger market. And they've been increasing since then quite a bit. Now, to the point they've been increasing where their competitors are now big hotel chains. But big hotel chains have an advantage that early Airbnb didn't have, which is dealing with congestion. And Airbnb had a real congestion problem, which is that there were lots of apartments, it was hard to reserve one because you might try to reserve one and fail. That is, several people would try at the same time to reserve the apartment. They would give the reservation to someone else, and then they would say to you, I'm so sorry, and now you would have to try again. So think how hard it would be to get a hotel room at, say, the Four Seasons Hotel in Prague. If hotels worked that way, what would that mean? You'd call up the Four Seasons Hotel, and you'd say, I'd like a room for Friday. And they'd say, which room? And you'd say, oh, okay, how about room 421? And they'd say, I'm so sorry, that room is taken. And then they'd hang up, and you'd have to call back, and you'd say, how about room 422? And they'd say, oh, sure, we're available on Friday. That was Airbnb's problem. Each owner might own just one property. And so you would say, I want to be in Prague on Friday, and you'd have to ask one apartment at a time. So what Airbnb did is they started to automate the confirmation process. If you had a good enough reputation, hosts could sign up and say anyone with a good enough reputation on the site can automatically have my property when it's vacant. And as soon as you applied for it, it would stop appearing on my app. So there wouldn't be a long queue of people. You would only have one person waiting at a time in case you were still looking at each person. So the response time got faster and the success rate got much better. And that's why Airbnb is today a competitor of hotels. And of course, there's and that's the thing called instant booking, that sometimes you can, if you have a good enough reputation on Airbnb, you can just automatically be accepted. And of course, there's this issue of trust and safety. You're going to go stay in someone else's apartment, and they're going to have you, a stranger, come and stay in their apartment. You know, there's some American comedian who makes jokes about the fact that when we were children, we were told not to get in cars with strangers, and now we take Ubers, and not to go into the homes of strangers, and now we go to Airbnb. So they have to do a lot of work to make sure that you're not an axe murderer, and that you know they are not an axe murderer, and that furthermore, you've been in people's apartments before and not ruined them. And that's why all these mechanisms about reputation come into play. Okay, and so if I wanted to stay a month in Prague, I could be offered a bunch of rooms. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about some markets and marketplaces. Let me take a moment. I'm sometimes going to speak casually about markets and marketplaces as if they were the same thing. But mostly what I'm talking to you about is the design of marketplaces, okay, that have particular market mechanisms that help a market to work by helping it become thick and deal with congestion and be trustworthy and safe. Okay, so even when I say markets, I mean there's an underlying market that we're trying to serve, but often I'll be talking about the marketplace, but I'll sometimes be a little casual about that distinction. Okay, so I've worked on some labor markets and some, but I'm not going to talk to you about labor markets today, except I've already mentioned that they're matching markets. What I'm going to talk about are school choice systems that I've worked on in the United States and kidney transplants. And both of those are interesting for me to talk about to you here in Czechia because on the one hand, in many places that don't have recently redesigned school choice systems, school choice is pretty complicated. And my understanding is that's a little bit true here in Prague. And I also want to talk to you about kidney transplantation, and it turns out Czechia is quite progressive in many aspects of kidney transplantation. So it's a pleasure to be here and help you celebrate that. Okay, so let me start with school choice, and I know very little about Czech school choice, except that it's still complicated, and I'll tell you how school choice used to be complicated in some American cities with which I've worked. When I say American cities, we organize schools by municipalities, okay? And there's not a national curriculum. Really, schooling is very local in the United States. So I'm going to tell you mostly about New York and Boston, which are the first two school systems I helped with revising their mechanisms, okay? Now, remember what markets have to do. They have to, so first of all, in municipal school systems, public schools, you can't buy your place into the best kindergarten. You have to somehow be assigned a place through a matching market. Okay, there's the law, not kindergarten, but the law requires students, starting in first grade, to be in school. So public schools are free. There are also private schools They interact, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Now, making the market thick is not a big problem. When the law requires everyone to go to school, then there's a big market for going to school. So I won't worry too much about thickness. Where it comes up in school choice is when you have different varieties of schools, getting them all to participate in the same admissions process, and that can be an issue. But congestion and safety of dealing with the assignment system have been big problems. And there's also questions of information. And one of the reasons we want school choice is that parents have some information about what schools would be good for their children, and we'd like to use that information in the assignment process. They don't always have great information, but if you can't get from them their information about what schools they want, you have trouble giving them what they want. Okay? But not every school system makes it safe for families to share the information with the municipality about which schools they want. And I'll get ahead of myself now and say briefly, there are a lot of choice systems that make it very important which school you say is your first choice. Because if you don't get the school you say is your first choice, bad things can happen to you and you can fall through the system and get a school that you don't like at all. So many of the systems that we've replaced with the systems I'm going to tell you about have the property that when they say to you, tell us which schools you would like, you can't really tell them which schools you would like. You have to instead think hard about which is the best school I can get for my child if I claim it's my first choice. And that's a different kind of problem. Okay? So I'm going to tell you in particular about New York City and Boston, and they're different to each other. They're different from each other. One of the ways they're different is school principals were very active participants in deciding who went to their school in New York City, but not at all in Boston. In Boston, there was already a centralized system where Boston Public Schools, the city bureaucracy, ran the assignment system, and principals just ran their schools once they were assigned students. Okay, and there are some other cities that we've worked with that are somewhere in between those things. So New York City is our biggest municipal school system. Over 1 million students go, and that means each year over 90,000 students enter high school. So in New York City, that's in 9th grade. So there are lots of 8th graders who have been coming up through the school system who need to be assigned a choice of a high school. And there's about 10% of new residents. So there are some people who didn't come up through the system who still need to go to high school. If you're 14 years old and you live in New York, you have to go to school. And the old system was they invited each family to submit a list of up to 5 choices. Then they photocopied those lists and distributed them to the schools that were on the list. So if you would list 5 schools, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that form would be your application to the schools, to those 5 schools. They would let the school know that you were applying with this preference list. And the schools independently made offers, although the offers the letters were sent out centrally. And only about 40% of the students got initial offers, and the rest were on waiting lists. And about 17,000 of those students got multiple offers. And one thing about one of the ways the waiting list works was if your high school student got 3 offers of high schools of admission to the 3 of the 5 places your family had listed, then you got a letter that said, congratulations, you've been admitted to high schools 2, 3, and 4 on your list. Okay? And then that came in a letter, and then you had to decide where to go. And you'd already formed a preference list, and when we looked carefully at this old system, we found that if you got admitted to high schools number 2, 3, and 4, you mostly went to high school number 2 rather than high school 3 or 4. So the preference list had a lot of information in them, but it took time to decide, to think about it, to talk to your neighbors, to boast that your kid had gotten admitted to 3 high schools. And what that meant was they only had time to do 3 rounds of this. After you chose one, the high schools that you hadn't chosen now had some new positions to offer. They could send out another letter, and then later they could do that a 3rd time. And then after that, there were about 30,000 students left in August. The school starts in September, who hadn't been assigned to schools, and they had to be assigned to schools that they hadn't expressed any preferences for. So that was the situation in New York, and that was the problem. They had congestion. They weren't good at making enough offers quickly enough so that they didn't have those 30,000 students who had to be administratively assigned to schools they hadn't given any information about in their preference list. Okay? Now, there are a couple of issues with this system. There's quite a few, but I highlighted some already that I want to bring to your attention. The first is that the schools show your rank order. Right? So if I'm the principal of the high school that you ranked third, I look at your application and I say, oh, look, I'm the third choice of this young man or young woman. And if I'm a popular high school that gets a lot of applications, I might say, you know, we want students who really want to come here. I'm only going to look at your application if you listed us as your first choice, because I get enough of those to fill my high school. So, of course, if enough schools do that, then you don't really have 5 choices, because you can't put any of those schools anywhere except your first choice and still get it, right? So it's important what you say for your first choice. And so it wasn't safe for families to list their true preferences, and everyone sort of understood this. In other words, the New York City Public High School handbook said, think about whether you can get in as you rank these schools, okay? And it also, remember, there are 30,000 students who were going to be assigned sort of arbitrarily. So principals, knowing this, would withhold places from the school system. They would create construction problems that they said allowed them to admit fewer students than they had last year. And then they would resolve those construction problems in September, because they knew they were going to, what they didn't want is to get randomly assigned those 30,000 students. What they preferred is to be able to choose which students came to them. Okay, so there was strategic behavior on both sides. Now, before I tell you about New York, let me tell you about Boston, which had a different problem but turned out to have the same solution as New York. Okay, so Boston already, when we met them, my colleagues and I, they already had a centralized system. And the way their centralized system worked is Boston Public Schools, the bureaucracy, assigned to each child a priority at each school. And the priority, for instance, for a child was very high if the child had an older sibling already going to the school. Okay? And it was high, but not that high, if there was no older sibling, but the child was within walking distance of the school. And after that, they gave every child a random number that was a tiebreaker. So when they started to run out of capacity for their schools, they decided who were the last students who could get in using the random lottery number. Okay? And they had a system for assigning students that was clearly meant to be beneficial to families, because the system was, they're going to look at the applications, they're going to look at all the first choice applications, and they're going to fill this, we're going to put as many people in the school as they can, because their objective is to give as many people as possible their first choice. And when they can't give any more people their first choice to a particular school, they use the random lottery to decide who actually gets in, and then they reject the rest. And people who are rejected in the first round, who didn't get their first choice, they then try to give as many of them as possible their second choice among schools that are still available. And then as many as possible their third choice amongst schools that are still available. So this is clearly, they're trying to be nice to students. They want as many people as possible to get their first choice. So what could be wrong with a system like this? Well, I already told you. If you don't get your first choice, if you don't get the school you say is your first choice, you may find that the school that is your second choice, that you say is your second choice, already filled all its positions with schools who said it was their first choice. So if you don't get your first choice, there's a good chance you won't get your second choice if it's also a popular school. And then maybe you won't get your third choice, and you'll drop way down until you are being assigned to a school that has empty spaces after everyone has been assigned schools they want, and those are not the best schools. Okay, so that was the problem in Boston. So they had different problems in New York and in Boston. In New York, there was a congestion problem, although they also had this problem of you had to be careful for many schools that you could only get in if you said they were your first choice. But they didn't have a congestion problem in Boston. They just had this safety problem. And indeed, in Boston, they believed their system was working very well, because a very high percentage of the students were assigned to schools that they had said were their first choice. So they thought, what could be wrong with this? We're giving everyone their first choice, not realizing that people were adjusting what they said was their first choice based on what they thought they could get. Okay, so I'm going to do a little magical mathematics just for a short time in the talk here, and I'm going to tell you about the kind of algorithm that now are used both in New York and Boston, and it's called the deferred acceptance algorithm. I'll explain why. And it comes from a 1962 paper by David Gale and Lloyd Shapley, and at the time the Nobel Prize for this kind of stuff was oriented. David Gale was no longer living, but I shared the 2012 prize with Lloyd Shapley, who was cited for this work that I'm going to tell you about. And there's and it's going to be easy to understand, I hope. Okay? So I'm going to describe to you a computer algorithm, but I'm going to describe it in words that make it sound like the students are doing things, the students and the schools. But the way you should understand it as a computer algorithm is what the students and schools are actually doing is they're submitting preference lists. The students submit preference lists over schools, and each school principal submits a preference list over students. And then the algorithm is going to use those preference lists to run through the matching process as if the students and schools were doing things, and that's the way I've described it. Okay, so the first step is students, and in New York, where the principals are active, they privately submit preferences. So no longer are we going to Xerox the sheet of your preferences and let the schools know whether or not they were your first choice. So right away, we're getting rid of the strategy of schools that says, I'll only admit people who list me as their first choice. They're not going to see that anymore. Okay? And then, like in the immediate acceptance algorithm, we're going to have each student apply to his or her first choice. But unlike in the immediate acceptance algorithm, we're not going to admit any students until we get to the end of the algorithm, until we see no more applications. Instead of admitting the students who choose a school as their first choice, we're going to have the school hold their applications up to the school's capacity and reject the ones they can't. So that's the same as before. There's a preference list of that the school has for the students. If the school has a kindergarten of class size 20 and only that class, then if they get more than 20 first choice applications, they don't reject those yet. They defer acceptance until the end of the algorithm, but they reject number 21, 22, and all the subsequent lower preference students. And every student who is rejected now applies to its next choice, so second choice, and the school looks at the students whose applications it's holding and the new applications that have come in. It organizes them according to its preferences. It doesn't care when you applied. So if you are high on their preference list, you go right to the top of their list, even though you didn't apply to them first. And they now, if they still only have 20 places, they reject the people beyond number 20 on their preference list. And that keeps going until there are no more rejections and no more applications. Okay? And only at that point do the schools, they've deferred their acceptance, they defer it until there are no more applications, and then they accept the applications that they're holding at the end. So they may have held your application at the beginning until enough students who were higher on their preference list applied, and then you got bumped off the list they were holding and had to apply to your next choice school, and that can happen at any point in the algorithm. Okay, so there's two interesting mathematical properties about this algorithm. And the first is that let me define an application to a matching of schools to students to be stable if there aren't a student and a school who are not matched to each other who would prefer to be, both prefer to be. So let me now explain to you why this always produces a stable matching with respect to the preferences that were stated. And when I say always, I mean no matter what those preferences are. So the input to this algorithm is going to be preferences from students and from schools, and I claim that it's never going to be that when we finally get the acceptances of students to schools, so now we know which students will go to which schools, it's never going to happen that a school and a student would both prefer to be matched to each other than someone who they were matched to. Why is that? Supposing I'm a student in this algorithm, and I end up matched to my third choice school. So I would, of course, prefer, if I've told the truth about my preferences, which I'll tell you about in a minute, I would, of course, prefer my first choice or my second choice to my third choice. But they don't prefer me. Why is that? Well, how did I get to my third choice school? First, I applied to my first choice, and they rejected me when they filled all their places with people they liked better. And then I applied to my second choice, and they held my application until they filled all their choices with people they liked better. And then I applied to my third choice, which accepted me at the end. So I would prefer to go to my first or second choice, but they don't prefer me. So the outcome is stable. There are no pairs. And you're going to see that's important in New York. There are no people coming trying to get into a school that the principal would prefer to have than the people he was assigned. Okay? And the second mathematical result I want to tell you about is a little harder to prove verbally, but it says it's safe for workers to, I say workers because sometimes they're labor markets, safe for students to state their true preferences. Okay? And the reason that's true, let me just give you an intuition for that. Remember what made the Boston system or the old New York system where some schools cared whether you listed them as their first choice. What made them dangerous to participate in was if you stated as your first choice a school that filled all its positions with other people who had stated it as their first choice, then you lost out on a lot of opportunities. But in the deferred acceptance algorithm, if I get rejected by the school I said was my first choice, when I apply to the school it says is my second choice, if they like me, if I'm high on their preference list, they're just as glad to see me as if I had applied to them at the first choice. So no harm comes to me from applying to them late. My probability of getting into each of my choices is, having been rejected by the higher ones, is just the same as if I had listed them first. Okay, so it's safe for people to state their true choices. Okay, now in the first year of operation, the big effect for New York was this solved congestion problems. That is, computerized systems, among other things, are fast, and so instead of 30,000 students who had to be assigned administratively, only 3,000 students had to. So we more successfully assigned students to schools that they had expressed some preference to. Okay? And that's a complicated story because we also let them give long lists. So there are a bunch of things to that. But another thing which has to do with stability is each year in the first several years, the results improved. And what I mean by improved is in 2004, the first year of operation, 34% of students got their first choice and 16% got their second choice. And the next year, with no change in the algorithm, more students got their first choice and more students got their first or second choice and more students got their first, second, or third choice than before. And that happened again in the third year and then sort of leveled out in the fourth year. And it's been many years since. And what's going on here? Well, remember, the principals used to withhold places because they knew they weren't getting a stable match. They would be students who they wanted who also wanted them, and they wanted to have seats available for them. So it took them 3 years to learn that that was no longer true, and that now they would get the best students they could if they showed all their places to the centralized mechanism. Okay, so there's benefits of various sorts when you start to have a good school choice system. So they were no longer being withheld. Okay, so I'm going to switch now from schools to a very different matching problem, different mathematically and different in terms of who the participants are. But let me just say that one reason I chose to talk about school choice here is I understand that school choice is still a little complicated in Prague, but that there are changes underway and proposals to think about it. And if there's time for questions and answers, I can, I'm happy to talk on that subject. And the reason I'm talking about kidney transplantation here is that this is a place where, as near as I can tell, Czechia does a very good job. So I want to help you celebrate that. Okay, so here's a picture of kidneys transplanted per million population. And there's a lot of information in this graph, but the blue lines are how many kidneys per million population are transplanted that the kidney comes from a dead person, from a deceased donor. Okay, and so I'm not mostly going to talk about deceased donation today, but that's a complicated process, and one reason there aren't enough deceased donor kidneys is that it's not everyone who dies, almost no one who dies in a way that makes their organs available for transplantation. Loosely speaking, you have to die in a hospital on a ventilator so that your organs don't lose oxygen when you stop breathing. So that's the blue. And the orange lines are transplants per million population from living donors. And kidneys are a little bit special. They're quite a bit special, but one of the reasons they're special is healthy people have 2 kidneys and can remain healthy with 1. And so a healthy person can donate a kidney, a live donor kidney, to someone who needs one. And so if there's someone you love who has kidney failure, which is a deadly disease, there's some chance that you turn out to be healthy enough to donate a kidney and you can donate it to them. Okay, there's also, as I'll explain, sometimes you're healthy enough to donate a kidney, but you can't donate it to the person you love because kidneys have to be well matched. But anyway, here's what you see is that Czechia is pretty high in this ranking of kidneys per million population. If you look at total transplants, the US is the highest. Actually, this is probably 1 year out of date. Post-COVID, Spain is higher than the US in deceased donor transplants per million population, but the US is still highest. And Czechia is quite high. Okay, mostly you do deceased donor transplants here in the Czech Republic. Okay, and so you've got a population of around 10 million, and so does Israel, and that's going to come up. So I've marked them too. But China and India, which are very big countries, they have very low rates per million population. But size matters, and if instead of looking at kidney transplanted per million population, we look at total number of kidney transplants, then the US is first with a population of 330 million. China is second and India is third, both with populations of about 1.5 billion. Brazil is fourth with a population of 210 million. Czech Republic and Israel, remember they're actually both pretty successful, but they're very small. They both have population around 10 million, so they don't do many transplants per total, right? Okay, now when economists, so let me give you some numbers. I don't know the Czech numbers, but in the United States, about 130,000 people each year are newly diagnosed with kidney failure. So that's the incidence of kidney failure in the United States, 130,000 people a year, and we only do about 30,000 transplants a year. So that means there are 100,000 people a year who potentially could have their lives saved with a transplant who aren't going to get it. So there's a tremendous shortage of kidneys for transplant in the world, and that's also true around the world. And and so there are waiting lists for kidneys, and one of the jobs of a system that allocates deceased donor kidneys is to work its way through that kidney waiting list. Other organs are different. What makes kidneys special is there's kidney dialysis, which allows patients to stay alive for a while they wait for a transplant. When economists see a long line of people waiting, many of whom are not going to get what they're waiting for, this is the kind of thing that used to be characteristic of consumer goods in communist countries. We suspect that prices aren't being allowed to increase supply. And that's definitely true for kidneys. I have here a sentence from the US law, but almost all over the world, it's forbidden to pay a kidney donor for a kidney. Okay, so the US law says it's unlawful for any person to transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. Valuable consideration turns out to be a slightly complicated legal phrase, but what it clearly meant was you can't pay someone to donate a kidney. Okay, and that's true everywhere in the world except the Islamic Republic of Iran, where there's a legal monetary market for kidneys. There are, however, black markets for kidneys, and some of them are very black. Some of them operate outside of the usual medical institutions. So, there are problems in the kidney world. Okay, so years ago I wrote a paper called "Repugnance as a Constraint on Markets." And so when my colleagues and I started to think about how we could help increase kidney transplants, we thought, let's not touch this repugnance for paying for kidneys. Let's see if we can, because that'll take a long time, and people are arguing for that in the, certainly since the turn of this century and well before that. But let's find something we can make more progress on. And so remember, I said to you that a healthy person has 2 kidneys and can remain healthy with 1. But kidneys have to match. So this is not the most difficult kind of incompatibility, but here's a simple example of how the first kidney exchanges worked. Here's donor 1 who loves recipient 1 and would like to give her a kidney, but they have different blood types that aren't compatible. And similarly, donor 2 would like to give a kidney to recipient 2, but he needs a blood type A kidney, and donor 2 is blood type B. So what we used to do before kidney exchanges, we would send the donors home. We'd say, so sorry, you can't give to the person you love. Go home. And the patient would remain on the waiting list for a deceased donor kidney. And in the US, thousands of people die each year on the waiting list. And many of them are never put on the waiting list because we need 130,000 a year, roughly, and we only have 30,000. So the waiting list is not a great place to be, although it's a great place to be if you get a deceased donor kidney. But notice that we need a B-type kidney, and we have one in the picture. And we need an A-type kidney, and we have one in the picture. So in a kidney exchange, each patient gets a compatible kidney from another patient's donor. Okay, from another patient's intended donor. And that increases the number of living donor transplants. Living donor transplants have some longer-term survival properties than deceased donor transplants, so it's a win-win situation. Now, making the market thick and dealing with congestion are a problem, and congestions have to do with, when we started to do kidney exchange in the United States, almost all of the exchanges, like the one I just showed you, were simultaneous. That is, we do the surgery simultaneously. So what does that mean? So here's a picture of half of a kidney exchange going on. I'm the man in the yellow gown keeping my hands out of the way. And here's a kidney, and Steve Woodall is preparing it to be transplanted into this guy, and we're all in Cincinnati, Ohio. And at the same time, Mike Reese, who's one of the heroes of the story that I'm going to tell you, is in Toledo, Ohio, working with the other half of the exchange, right? The other patient and the donor of this patient in the nearby town of Toledo, Ohio. And before they began, but after they had successfully anesthetized the patients and donors and made the initial incisions, Steve got on his phone from the operating room and called up Mike and said, we're ready to go. Are you ready to go? And when he heard that he was, then they did the nephrectomy. They took the kidney out. Whoops. Here's the kidney. And transplanted it. So these happen simultaneously. So there isn't a mistake. You know, some patient doesn't react badly to anesthesia and is not able to go through it or something like that. So both pairs get a kidney. That's great. But to do that simple two-way exchange requires 4 operating rooms for 2 nephrectomies and 2 transplants and 4 operating teams. It's logistically difficult. It's, in a certain sense, medically simple because the kidneys are compatible. You don't have to overcome the incompatibility. But it's hard to scale up to national scale. And we learned to do exchange between 3 pairs. You know, my work started in New England, where there were 14 transplant centers in what's called Region 1. And so patients and donors could travel by car. Donors would travel. And sometimes we could have 6 people in the picture. But 6 people means 3 transplants and 3 nephrectomies, so 6 simultaneous surgical teams. It's a logistically hard thing to do. So one of the innovations we were able to help our medical colleagues make was to start chains of transplants that didn't have to be all conducted simultaneously. So let me briefly tell you about that by first explaining why we do these simple transplants simultaneously. Okay? Supposing we didn't. So this is a counterfactual. We always try to do these simultaneously. But supposing on day 1, donor 2 successfully gives a kidney to recipient 1. So he doesn't have a kidney anymore. And suppose we were doing it non-simultaneously. So on day 2, for whatever reason, donor 1 is unable or unwilling to give a kidney to recipient 2. Okay? That's a really bad outcome for pair 2 here because they've had a surgery that didn't help them and they no longer have a kidney. They can't take part in the next kidney exchange run. So that's really bad, so we try to never do that. But in the US, we have about 400 non-directed donors a year nowadays. A non-directed donor is someone who wants to give a kidney to someone but doesn't have a particular someone in mind. So in particular, he's going to give a kidney and he doesn't have to get one back. So we can start a chain where on day 1, the non-directed donor gives a kidney to recipient 1, and on day 2, donor 1 is supposed to give a kidney to recipient 2. And supposing, for whatever reason, same reason as here, donor 1 fails to do that. Well, that's really disappointing, but it's not tragic because donor 2 and recipient 2 still have a kidney. They were scheduled to get a kidney before they gave one, so they haven't been irreparably harmed. They're disappointed, but the next time, the next day they can participate in kidney exchange because they still have a kidney. So breaks in the chain are less costly when you have a donor-initiated chain, and therefore you can start to experiment with them and see where you get. And where you get, and here's Mike Reese, the guy I told you about, he organized the first non-simultaneous chain in the world, and it had 20 people in the picture. Here's the picture from the New England Journal of Medicine, and here's the picture from, we have a magazine called People magazine, which is in the Sunday newspapers. And so most of these people allowed their identities to be made. So there's 20 people in the picture. And the last one, this is the very first non-simultaneous chain, the last one has blood type AB. And it was a mistake to not do something quickly with her, because it turns out in kidney exchange, for reasons I won't get into, it's not so common to find someone who can take a blood type AB kidney in the kidney exchange world. And that's partly because blood type AB is relatively rare in the United States, but also because people with blood type AB don't have blood type incompatibilities. So the people who are in the kidney exchange had some tougher reason why they couldn't take a kidney, and that made it hard for them to take Helena McKinney's kidney. But she was game, and she waited 3 years and added another 12 people to the picture when an appropriate kidney recipient was found for her. So chains can be pretty long, and But nowadays, if we ended a chain with a blood type AB donor, we would ask her to donate immediately to someone on the 90,000 person long waiting list in the United States, because 4% of Americans have blood type AB, and so there's plenty of people who could take her kidney who are waiting for a deceased donor and who don't have an intended donor to continue the chain. Okay, but in fact, 12 more people got added in what was partly an operational mistake of ours. Now, chains can be long. Here's one that in 2012 was the longest it had been. This is a picture from the New York Times. And so let me explain why chains can be long, because it also will help me talk about why crossing international borders is helpful. Okay? Supposing chains can be long, and long is good because there are a lot of transplants in them, but it's also good because we can reach, hard to match patients. So what does it mean to be a hard to match patient? Well, for some patients, the only barriers are the ABO blood type. But for many patients who are hard to match, they have a lot of antibodies to human proteins, human leukocyte antigens. And what that means is, even if you show them lots of kidneys that have compatible blood types, they can't take them because they might be only able to take 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 kidneys that would be compatible with their immune system. So mostly, they're never going to be able to participate in pairwise exchanges. But why are chains important? Let's suppose that each one of us in this moderately big room represents a hard-to-match patient-donor pair. So my pair is hard to match and your pair is hard to match because the patients are highly sensitized. They can hardly take any kidney. Okay? Then the chance that my pair can give your pair a kidney is very small because you guys are hard to match. But the chance that we can give a kidney to someone in the room is not so small because there are lots of people in the room. So maybe we can give a kidney to someone. Now, the chance that you can give a kidney back to us is very small because we're hard to match. But the chance that you can give a kidney to someone else in the room and that they can give a kidney to someone else in the room. So when you start to have a thick market of patient-donor pairs, you can start to reach patients who wouldn't have any chance of being reached in smaller exchanges. And of course, we're a country of 300 million people and we have, pretty relatively big kidney exchange. But even in the US, there are people who are so hard to match that we wish we could cooperate with our Canadian friends across the border. But even before recent events, the two medical systems proved hard to get cooperation. So we haven't yet managed to do cross-border kidney exchange with Canada, which would help both our hard-to-match patients and their hard-to-match patients. Okay? Now, one thing you can do to try to get more chains is to initiate some chains with a deceased donor kidney. I'm not going to talk more about that because I'm running a little late, but here's a paper. Many of these papers that I talk to you about have both surgeons and economists on them, and this is one of those papers. Mike Reese is the hero of this story. In medicine, for those of you who are economists, in medicine, authors fight to be the last author. That's a very prestigious position. So in economics, we don't, we mostly do alphabetical order. Whoops. Okay. So we propose that. The US bureaucracy is hard to deal with. In Italy, they've started to do deceased donor chains. And there's an economist on this, along with some surgeons. Antonio Nicolo is an economist at the University of Padua. In the US, we're not ready to publish yet, but we have so far, in complicated ways because of regulation, done 15 deceased donor-initiated chains that have resulted in 53 transplants. That is, normally when you transplant a deceased donor kidney, it's one transplant. You give it to someone on the list. But if you can go through a chain, one deceased donor can give to someone in the kidney exchange waiting list whose intended donor gives it to someone else, whose intended donor gives it to someone else, whose intended donor gives it to someone on the wait list. Okay, so you're borrowing a kidney from the deceased donor wait list, and you're returning a living donor kidney to someone who was waiting for a deceased donor kidney. So you're not robbing the deceased donor list, but all the people typically in kidney exchange are also on the deceased donor waiting list. So this is a pretty good thing if you can do it. But another good thing that you could do is you could exchange across borders, which also has lots of regulatory obstacles. So I used Google Translate on an article that I couldn't read that was in Czech, but I hope that what the headline says is that Czech doctors perform paired exchange with Israel for the first time. This is in 2019. There have been subsequent exchanges with Israel and with other places. Doctors from IChem and Israeli hospitals carried out this exchange. And I believe Dr. Froniak is here in the audience somewhere. And the kidneys traveled to Israel, moved around in Israel, and then traveled back to the Czech Republic. And here's Dr. Froniak and Dr. Tamar Ashkenazi, who's the head of Israel transplant. I had met one of the people in this picture before, and just before the talk, I met the other one, so I'm very glad to be here. Now, in 2021, I went to the United Arab Emirates to participate in the first kidney exchange between Israel and the UAE. And so I mention that because, Israel was in that previous exchange. It has, with Czechia, it has population 10 million. Same thing with the UAE. They have a population of about 10 million. And, this is one of the benefits of peace. Peace can be fleeting, but, one day there'll be peace everywhere. And if we could, and the story about Israel was there was this three-way exchange. Here's Tamar Ashkenazi again. And each of the recipients was a mother. And the reason that's important, and the reason it was true in this case, is that in the course of childbirth, mothers can become sensitized to the proteins, to the human leukocyte antigens from the father, because children get half their proteins from dad and half from mom. And after the placenta breaks, the immune system of the mom can be exposed, in which case she has antibodies and can't accept a kidney from her husband or her children, and maybe not from a lot of other people also, because it can become highly sensitized. So, the pool of available pairs was too small, both in the UAE and Israel, but a three-way exchange, saved 3 people, and there have been other exchanges there too. Now, again, these things can sometimes be complicated. Here's Marisol Robles standing actually next to me in that photograph, and here she is in this picture. And part of the story is here's an American kidney exchange chain, and it was going to stop with a donation to someone on the deceased donor list because a lot of American surgeons at the time thought that a 67-year-old person was maybe too old to take a kidney for their patient. And that's probably, there were reasons American transplant centers are required by regulation to be very risk averse. So that's probably not a fully justified decision, because I remember when I was 67, I wasn't old. But anyway, this chain would have ended, but instead it goes to Marisol Robles, and her cousin continues the chain, and it continued off the screen. So there's benefits both to the American patients and to the Mexican patients who have excellent health care in Mexico, but no kidney exchange. So that was a reason to bring her across the border. And there was some controversy about this, and I'm not going to have time to tell you about it, but let me say, but in Mexico it wasn't controversial. So the Newsweek on Espanol published a cover story about it, which says, transplants of kidneys between the US and Mexico, a bridge of life. So one reason I'm hopeful that we'll eventually be able to really more thoroughly break down borders is it's a good thing for everyone involved in the exchange. It's like kidney exchange within a country. Everyone gives a kidney and gets a kidney. So it has a very equitable side to it. Now, just incidentally, when I talk about crossing borders, different countries have different problems. So in India, they don't allow non-directed donors. Many European countries don't either. But there's a transplant nephrologist there named Vivek Kutte, who's been organizing complicated cyclical exchanges, which take a lot of care, and he treats anonymity very differently than we do in the US. In the US, to make a picture like the one I showed you, people don't know each other until after everything has happened, and then they have to agree to meet if they want. In India, what he does with a long cycle like this is he convenes everyone in advance, all the patients and all the donors, and they all sort of agree, we're in this together and we're going to do it. And that's been working in India. He makes all sorts of emergency contingency preparation in case there's a broken link, which there can be. Sometimes a patient is no longer healthy enough to get a transplant. Sometimes a donor is no longer healthy enough to give a transplant. But he's been very successful with this. So there are lots of ways to organize exchanges. And they have very modern equipment there. So here I am sitting in India in an operation that's being done with a Da Vinci robot. And Dr. Modi, whose back is there, he's not in the sterile field. The patient is here and is attended by all sorts of people who are scrubbed in and gloved and gowned, but he's not. When I came into the OR, he got up and reached out to shake my hand, and I realized we were touching hand to hand, which never happens in an OR. But of course, he's not in the sterile field. He's playing a video game on this screen that gives him a highly magnified view of what he's doing, and it looks like a very effective way to do it. And he's pretty close, but there may come a time when he doesn't have to be close, when the internet is reliable enough that he can do the surgery with the assistance of the surgeons who are touching the patient, but he might be elsewhere. So the prospect of being able to cross borders is a real kind of prospect. It's mostly bureaucracy that gets in the way. Okay, and in particular, the World Health Organization believes that countries should be self-sufficient in transplant. They don't like crossing borders very much. They also don't like crossing borders for things like collecting blood plasma. That's another story that I could tell, but I'm going to try to end on time. But notice that if you're an economist, it seems very strange to require that countries be self-sufficient in substances of human origin, they call them. SOHO is the EU word, the European Union jargon for substances of human origin. And notice that we don't require countries to be self-sufficient in anything else. Not in food. When there's a drought, we don't say to countries, oh, you should have had a more robust agricultural sector. Next time you should grow more food. We send food. When there's COVID, we don't say to countries, you really need a domestic pharmaceutical industry. We send vaccines. Often we sell them vaccines. There's something close to transplant, which is bone marrow, blood stem cells, and we have international exchange for that. But international exchange for kidneys is still hard. But here in Chechnya, in Chechnya, you are doing that. So let me end by saying markets, and as I began, markets are human artifacts. We make them. They're tools. We make them to serve purposes. And there are lots of different kinds of markets, and most markets aren't pure commodity markets. Okay, so there are lots of matching markets in the world. And we need to collectively decide how we want to use markets, what we want them to do for us, and how to fix them when they're broken. And that's what market design is about. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see if we have questions. There's a microphone to be passed, down the aisle. We have time for a few questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was terrific. I think everybody is probably eager to find out how long did it take you to develop these mechanisms? I mean, we were together, as colleagues. So I went swimming with him, so I slowed him down. But if you take that aside, give us a sense of, to develop this.
Well, so, you and I have had decades to do our work, and it's taken decades. But let me tell you about the beginning of kidney exchange, because it began before I knew that it was a real thing. It began in Pittsburgh, so where we were colleagues. So in 1974, there was a new journal called the Journal of Mathematical Economics. And in the very first issue, volume 1, number 1, Lloyd Shapley, with whom I shared the Nobel Prize, and Herb Scarf wrote a paper talking about how you could trade houses if you couldn't use money. And economists do this kind of thing, not because they were unaware that we use money to trade houses, but because it gives you a chance to exercise your theoretical muscles and see how things would work if we didn't have that great market design invention of money. And so I would teach this to my students in a game theory class, and they would complain, "Professor, we use money to trade houses." But by this time I was at the University of Pittsburgh, where it was a big transplant center in the 1980s, one of the biggest in the world. And so to keep everyone calm, I would say, fine, kidneys. And so I started to develop lectures and apply the theory we started to have for kidney exchange, never thinking it would be a real thing. So that's in the 1980s. And then in 1998, we moved to Boston. And in 2000, there was a kidney exchange in Rhode Island Hospital, and it was in the newspaper. And I remembered, I have a lot of class notes about this. And so we wrote a paper, Typhoon Sunmez and Utko Undver and I, we wrote a paper specifically addressing the problem of kidney exchange. We sent it to all the kidney surgeons whose email addresses we could find. And only one responded, but he was my Harvard colleague, and we helped him found the New England program for kidney exchange. So 2 decades at least.
Thank you. You were talking about how long it took for the principals to change their strategies to actually have an efficient system. The parents of the students, were they able to shift to really list their preferences transparently right away, or did it took some?
No, it took some time. So the first year in Boston, we helped them with this new algorithm, and they sent home some backpack mail to students, to their families, and they had these things called family information centers that were meant to describe the schools and the whole process. And there was a page in the brochure that said there's a new system, it makes it safe to submit your preferences. If you have any questions, here's a phone number you can call. And at the other end of that phone was a very able staff member of the Boston Public Schools who understood everything. We had worked with him closely the whole time. And so he called us, very quickly and said, "I'm getting a lot of calls from that number." And what the people are saying to me is they say, "Do I understand correctly that it's safe to put my true preferences?" And he'd say, "Yes, you understood exactly right." And then the caller would say, "Because that's not what the nice ladies at the Family Information Center are saying." And they were still giving the old advice from the previous year. So one of the things we learned in this, as we went from city to city, is our job wasn't just to help design a new algorithm, it was also to design a communication package. And that helped somewhat, but nothing is perfect. On the other hand, in the old Boston system, you didn't have, I mean, not everyone understood. About 20% of people, when we looked at the data to convince Boston, about 20% of the people in their old system where you had to get your first choice right, about 20% of the people put a second choice, their second choice was a school that no one had ever gotten admitted to except as a first choice. So they were making a mistake with the old system. Nevertheless, columns in the Boston Globe would explain the system and how you had to be strategic about it. So after a while, the columns in the Boston Globe started to say it's a new system and you can submit your true preferences.
Congratulations, great talk, and thank you for that. Two questions. First is, how long did that take you to understand the medical needs from the per donation? Because for us it was critical with our IT guys. It was like we were speaking two completely different languages and not understanding each other for very long. And B, we keep going with the software we developed every year with novelties, introducing like those who are highly sensitized can get a bioincompatible kidney and so on. So each particular patient has got its own variables to get a chance for the kidney. So is there a particular group? I know the surgical guys from US, but I don't know any of the mathematicians. So is there any group focused on that which keeps going with the software?
So I think the best software in the world right now is made by my Stanford colleague Itai Ashlagi, and he gives it away for free. You can, get a password for it and talk to him, and I'm sure he would love to talk to you. It's incorporated into Mike Reese's software. He also is interested in doing international exchanges. One of the advantages of Mike Reese's software is you can anonymously see not just your patients, but patients all over the world, so you can see if you want to explore international exchange. So there's excellent software available now, but you're quite right, not everyone uses it. But in particular, the guts of this software are optimization software called integer programming, which is very flexible. You can give a lot of weight to someone who has, more than 99% sensitivity, PRA. You can, give a lot of weight to children. You can give, so it's very flexible. And it's good at finding hard to find matches. So that's what optimization software is good at. We should talk about this.
Excellent. Let's maybe time for one more question. Well, let me ask. You kind of almost mentioned the plasma issue, where there could be trade across country borders, and so are there reasons to be optimistic that if we don't require self-sufficiency, that the nightmare scenarios of buying organs from poor people in poor countries would not materialize?
Okay. So the EU Parliament in the last couple of years made a resolution, I don't know that they can make laws, but that starting soon, like 2027, they don't want European countries to pay for what they call substances of human origin. So that includes blood plasma. And there are only 5 countries in the EU, of which I think Czechia is one, where you can pay for plasma. And those are the only 5 countries in which there's enough domestic plasma supply. But there's not a terrible shortage of plasma, the way there is of kidneys, because countries that don't think you should pay for plasma can buy plasma from the United States. We are the Saudi Arabia of blood plasma. So you can pay plasma donors in the United States, and we export tens of billions of dollars of plasma and plasma products. And that's why there aren't shortages of plasma in Europe. So in the US, we have pretty strong rule of law and capable regulators. Everything is subject to change now, but we haven't had a disaster. It's not that there are black markets in the U.S. for plasma. It's not that the donors come to bad ends. It's a big international market. So we'll see. I was in Italy last year at the Higher Institute of Health, just as the EU was making these pronouncements. And I got to talk to someone who was introduced to me as the Italian blood czar. And I said to him, what's going to happen to the 5 countries where they pay for plasma. And he said, oh, nothing's going to happen. They're just going to change the language around the payments they make. Instead of saying we're paying for plasma, they're going to pay for time and effort and inconvenience. And they'll keep paying the same, so they'll be okay. And the rest of Europe may continue to buy from the United States.
Well, on that optimistic note, before we thank, I'll just mention that we can continue informal discussions in the room in the back, downstairs. And thank you so much, Al.
Thank you.